For decades, we have been asking ourselves why Africa has always been exporting human resources but never exporting industrial goods. We've been asking ourselves why Africa has been exporting slaves at the very beginning and now our professionals to Europe, the United States, and even Arabia, but never exporting industrial goods. We've been asking ourselves classically why Africa is a number one producer of raw materials but not a number one producer of industrial goods. But in all this discussion, we've never asked why the situation has been so for a very long time. There are nations in this world that were once in our position. Nations like Singapore, nations like South Korea, nations like Japan. But today, these nations have somersaulted over Africa. And right now, they moved from third world countries to first world countries. With the nations such as China, previously, after suffering the pangs of invasion, war, colonization, and humiliation, now rising to a point where China has matured and is actually rising above the United States, evolving past the economic systems and becoming a superpower on its own right. So the question is, why is Africa not exporting industrial goods? Look at what Japan did in the 18th and the 19th century. The first thing Japan did was to send a consignment of her own intellectuals to Europe and the United States. This was part of their modernizing campaign. The same intellectuals came back and brought Western know-how to Japan. This Western know-how was used by Japan to build the human resources they required to begin the process of industrialization. At the beginning, there were a few corporations and organizations from Western countries. But later, their intellectuals were able to take advantage of their intellect and knowledge from Western countries and reverse engineer everything they had learned from the West and gradually began building their own industries, bottom, base up, eventually overtaking some of these countries in places such as electronics and shipping, for example, and even military production, for example. The same is also true of South Korea and of China. During the 1980s, the Chinese government became one of the largest exporters of intellectual capacity to the United States. Many of their intellects went to Harvard, to MIT, to Stanford, and many famous American universities, and later on returned to China with this knowledge. Because China did not have advanced industries, Western corporations were allowed to come into China and exploit Chinese cheap labor for a purpose. So for some time, the Chinese were actually learning on the ropes, and they were actually copy-pasting everything the Western corporations were doing, and they were reverse engineering everything the Western corporations were doing. In the meantime, China opened up export processing zones and industrial centers as part of the experiment on the free market. These Western corporations were allowed to enter this location. They made billions in the process, but the Chinese gradually began eating into their cake. They began eating into their pie, because the Chinese government subsidized their corporations, and soon the Chinese corporations were outproducing Western companies, which later on failed to compete against Chinese production. And what happened was they had to go one by one. And to this day, most of these corporations are having a hard time competing in China, while China has succeeded in replacing all their industries one by one, from electronics to clothing to shipping to the aerospace industries, and very soon in the aviation industries, while at the same time now allowing more of the intellectuals to come back home when the ecosystem for economics and the free market is widespread. That's what the Chinese did. That's what the Japanese did. That's what the South Koreans did. And that's what Africa must do. We have absolutely no choice but first of all to allow our brothers and sisters in Western countries with advanced education to come home. Secondly, we need to allow a few of these corporations from the West to come here and allow our brothers and sisters, especially in places such as South Africa, to allow these intellectuals to occupy the highest positions in industrial management, the industrial production for decades. Gradually, we create the right environment, especially we start reducing the power of big government, cut down big taxes, and then allow these individuals to transfer their skills from these companies to their own companies, and we make it easy for them to open their companies. Gradually, as our own intellectuals now start running their corporations, using our own labor and using the know-how they have collected from Western countries, they will begin to outproduce these individuals from this country, these foreign investors, and gradually acquire the financial capital themselves after producing commodities for our consumption to outproduce, acquire financial capital needed to outproduce these investors, employ our young brothers and sisters, and then produce surpluses, which will now be required for export. First of all, within the African ecosystem, and then later on, the world at large. If we can do that, if we can create that ecosystem, that environment, the playing field that is required for our intellectuals to open up corporations, be able to compete at a competitive rate, be able to compete at opportunity costs, and gradually replace these foreign producers who will be able to harness our own raw materials for our own production and consumption, and later on completely replace successfully all this capital placed in our land by foreigners, and eventually Africa will rise to the highest level as the best market for production of finished goods, exportable within the African market first of all, and then later on across the globe. And this will begin by us starting by reforming our political system, reducing the expenditure of our political system, allowing a free market to build up where our brothers and sisters, our intellectuals now coming from abroad, can exploit the environment they are in for the profit and for the prosperity of the African universe.